Hey everyone, welcome to Crushing Classical, redefining a thriving classical music career. I'm Tracy Friedlander, and today I'm talking with Cliff Colnot. You may or may not have heard of him, and I want you to know that he is one of the most influential people in my life and career. Cliff Colnot is a conductor, educator, and arranger. He was music director of Civic Orchestra of Chicago for 22 years, as well as orchestra director at DePaul University in Chicago. I worked with him personally in both places. What I recommend listening for in this interview is Cliff's uncommon philosophy on preparation, as well as what it takes to be a leader. He shares the pitfalls that most conductors and musicians fall into where preparation is concerned. We also discuss a method of learning that has the potential to completely revolutionize the way you absorb and apply information inside and outside rehearsal. You'll also hear a clear-cut approach for becoming a well-prepared leader, whether you're aiming to lead as a teacher, a conductor, or just to become the best musician you can possibly be. If you have any questions for him about his approach as you listen to this episode, you can contact him directly at cliffccm@aol.com. His email address is also listed in the show notes. Before we begin, a couple of things. Please join the conversation at facebook.com/crushingclassical as well as Crushing Classical on Instagram. If you love our content, it would mean the world to us for you to comment and share it with your classical musician friends and colleagues. I'd like to thank Fix Music for being a sponsor of Crushing Classical podcast. FixMusic.com is your online resource for affordable, high-quality sheet music. Fix also offers unique buying options for individuals, teachers, and schools. Whether you have a large private teaching studio or you run a music program, Fix has a solution for you. Contact them through their website for more information. Fix offers priority and priority express shipping at super affordable rates, meaning they do not pad their shipping rates to make money. If you need sheet music fast, Fix will expedite it to you as inexpensively as possible. Also, remember to use the discount code CRUSH and get 10% off your order. Let's get started. Hi, Cliff. How are you?
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for being on the show today. It's such an honor to have you here. So I worked with you at DePaul as a grad student as well as a member of Civic Orchestra. And I really had the most amazing experience being in your orchestras. But I wanted to start out this interview before you were doing all of the conducting that you've done. So I know that you were a bassoon player, correct?
Yes.
Yes, and so your first job or your job playing was in the lyric opera?
Correct.
So tell me why you ultimately ended up leaving that job.
Well, I realized that reed making was a vital part of professional bassoon playing, and I was simply not adept at making reeds. So a little story, I was playing the Copeland Appalachian Spring for a small ensemble with the contemporary chamber players on bassoon, and during the opening I had a quiet, simple entrance which didn't speak, and it was then that I said, no more, and gave up the bassoon.
Just like that, you just gave it up 100%?
Yep.
So did you already have some other things? Were you doing conducting as well at the same time? How was that to just leave a job like that?
Well, while I was playing bassoon in Chicago, I had already been conducting some jazz ensembles and some occasional small new music groups. So it was simply a matter of increasing my availability for conducting new music while continuing to conduct jazz ensembles at Northwestern.
Oh, okay. So you were working through Northwestern as well. That's great.
Yes.
When did you eventually make your way to Civic when you started doing the preparatory? I mean, when I was there, you were the music director, but you told me that before that, it was your job to be the prep conductor. So can you tell me about how that ended up happening?
Sure. The CSO music director at the time was Daniel Barenboim, and he asked me to prepare the civic orchestra for visiting conductors and for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so as he observed my work with the orchestra, he gave me more and more responsibility. And also during this time, I was studying orchestral scores with Mr. Barenboim. So it seemed to work out great.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. I didn't realize that you got to do that partnership as well with him. So, and then so you initially started as that, you worked your way into being the music director of Civic after that
Right,
initial
right.
preparation.
Exactly. I was hired by Civic to be the preparatory conductor, and then Pierre Boulez was conducting the Civic Orchestra in a couple of modern compositions, and he needed someone to lead a few special rehearsals before he worked with the orchestra.
Okay.
And because I had done a little work at the Chicago Symphony in new music, primarily working with the composer in residence, Shulamit Ran, I was a natural choice for helping Mr. Boulez. And since I didn't mess up the rehearsals, it led to more work and eventually Civic.
Right. And then you mentioned that the new music started with Chicago Symphony. Would you say that that sort of came out of those experiences with Civic, doing the music now?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I had conducted some CSO new music events through my association with the composer in residence, and as a result of that collaboration, I was given a chance to lead Music Now, and I've been the principal conductor of that group since its inception 20 years ago.
Wow, fantastic. So,
Yep.
I know that you were on the faculty at DePaul and I think University of Chicago, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And are you still on those faculties now?
Well, I'm still on the DePaul faculty, and I conduct the wind ensemble, the symphony orchestra, coach chamber music, and teach a class in teaching principles. And
Fantastic.
after a very long tenure at the University of Chicago, conducting their new music ensemble Contempo and teaching advanced orchestration, I left them last year, and though I continue to go around the country to various music schools and do guest conducting and guest lecturing.
Oh, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that because one of the things I want to talk about to you with you today is your concept and your philosophies on preparation because I think I can speak to the fact that you've all these opportunities culminated for you based on the fact that you were starting as a preparatory conductor at Civic and people saw how you did it and how you were really doing an amazing thing with people preparing the orchestra. So, and that was the very first thing I noticed was your level of detail that you brought to rehearsal. You just knew exactly what you were going to do down to the very minute of every rehearsal. So, can you tell us a little bit about your philosophy on preparation?
Sure. For every score that I prepare, I do a complete harmonic analysis of every single note.
Wow.
This is very labor intensive, of course, but I learned this from Daniel Barenboim that it was critical to an effective rehearsal that every note be harmonically analyzed. And then from this harmonic analysis, I'm able to determine the phrasing, balance, and overall musicality. So I carefully plan each part of the rehearsal so that there's no improvising.
Interesting. Okay, that is not normally how it's done.
No, that's right.
So you just said that you got a lot of that learning analysis from Barenboim, but did you get influenced somewhere else from just the concept of not winging it, not leaving anything to chance at a rehearsal? Where did that come from?
Well, Dr. Clifford Madsen and Dr. Joseph White, both at Florida State University Music School, were strong influences. Dr. Madsen became my mentor at Florida State, and Dr. White coached me in chamber music. And then, as I had mentioned, I studied with Mr. Barenboim for many years and gained tremendous insights into the symphony orchestra, its instruments, and how to rehearse.
Fantastic. So you went to Florida State.
I did.
Okay. So was your major bassoon performance or conducting? Did you have a focus there?
I got my undergraduate degree at Florida State, and then I got my PhD at Northwestern in Evanston.
Okay.
And I didn't specialize in bassoon or conducting at either institution. I'd say that my music education was more generalized, which in retrospect is a very good thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting because it's not what I did, and I don't think that's very common now. So, what kind of advice would you give to students in that regard, as far as why do you think that's a benefit, and what would you tell people to do if they were wondering about that?
That's a great question. I became aware of the importance of diversification and not specializing in one narrow activity when I was at Florida State. And I would say that there are certainly exceptions when students concentrate on one activity, like winning an audition in a major orchestra. But generally, I think it's a better idea to look for as many different activities as possible so that you have more career choices when you graduate. For instance, new music, Baroque music, library work, jazz, pop music, student government, etc. So I think it's a great idea for music students to be involved in as many different things as possible.
That makes a whole lot of sense, especially now when there's not a lot of jobs. There's not a lot of orchestra jobs available for everybody coming out of school. So
Exactly right.
yeah, that's great advice. So back to the preparation thing. I just in preparing for this interview, I was reminiscing a lot about the most impactful memories I had. And what I remember, the very first orchestra rehearsal I ever had at DePaul. I thought I was prepared. It was Siegfried Idol, and I had a solo, and that was what I was focused on. I was very nervous for it, but I didn't know a whole lot about the rest of the horn section or what was happening, just at all, except for my part. So that was my like where I was coming from for preparation, which I know now is not correct, but my first day going in, and I was so nervous, and I started to realize a totally different level of different way of preparing the orchestra and rehearsing. There was rhythms being looked at, slowed down so that everyone could hear the chord progression or note lengths would line up. Everything was down to a science almost, and very different. And I noticed too that you would zero in on specific places, even starting from the very first rehearsal. Like normally conductors will just run things straight through. And I noticed that that's not what we did. So what is your thinking and strategy behind doing it that way?
Well, I do understand the rationale behind running a new piece, but for me, it's more productive to anticipate the problems and briefly rehearse them beforehand, so that when they occur in the piece, the musicians are a little more comfortable with them, rather than the run-through kind of grinding to a halt. So
Yes.
that's the rationale behind looking at some of the more difficult spots beforehand.
That makes sense, because sometimes, like you said, grinding to a halt, that can happen and then leave you kind of wounded about it. with
Exactly.
a memory of what happened when it didn't go so well. So I could see that being, and I experienced it, so I know how different it is when that's done. And it's honestly the first time I've ever experienced it and rarely seen it since. But I know that people listening will want to access this kind of specificity themselves, I think, and kind of technique. And so, what do you think are like the biggest mistakes that you see that musicians and conductors make in their preparation?
That's another very good question. I would say that some of the biggest mistakes made by musicians are not listening to the work beforehand and not studying the score. Many times musicians come to rehearsals having no idea how the music really goes, which I find to be unbelievable at a certain level, and then at another level makes complete sense to me. And for conductors, I would say winging it at rehearsals and insulting the musicians at the same time is a real problem. Also, conductors tend to be very non-specific in rehearsals, which lead to a very inefficient and unpleasant experience for the musicians. You know, for example, as I go around to various professional groups and college groups to do lectures and work with their orchestras, and then I'll check out another ensemble's rehearsals at the same time while I'm there. I hear conductors saying, "Watch the intonation there. Let's do it again. There are rhythmic problems. Use your ear." I mean, and those are all things that are completely vague and not specific, and so the musicians in the ensembles become very quickly annoyed because there's no specificity. So I would say that's probably a big deal with conductors is the fact that they're chronically non-specific in rehearsals.
That's such a great way to put it. Chronically non-specific. Oh,
Yep.
you know, and sometimes, like you're saying, the winging it thing. You start to wonder if when a conductor is up there saying there's intonation problems there, you're wondering if they know themselves what the problem is.
Precisely.
You know, and that leads to, hey, does this person know what they're doing up there? Like if they can't tell that the third is too sharp and they're not saying that, you know, and sometimes maybe it's a thing, I don't want to step on people's toes, but I just really feel like it doesn't have to be personal. It's just objective. It's just, this is the facts. These are the chords, these are the notes that are being played. Let's fix it.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Exactly right.
Exactly. Well, you mentioned a little bit ago that you are lecturing on teaching approach, which I think is fantastic that you're doing that, because I felt as a teacher and conductor, you'd always made time for your students, and I really appreciated it. You just would listen to audition lists, discuss career and educational moves. In my case, you helped me figure out and navigate a change in studio to a different school, and I wanted to study with Dale Clevenger for a really long time, and you helped me to get connected with him, and I really always appreciated that. So, and I know all of the other Civic and DePaul people who I was with appreciated that too. So I wonder how and why did you take the time to go that extra mile when you're so busy with all that preparation that you have to do for rehearsal?
This is something that I learned from Dr. Madsen at Florida State. He first of all insisted that teachers should not engage in ad hominem comments to students, meaning anything personal or something that would embarrass them. And so I try to be positive and not sarcastic, and I also try to avoid approval errors, which are basically telling students that they're doing something beautifully when in fact they're not. I mean, it's certainly possible and preferred to be positive in rehearsals and in interactions with students, while at the same time being critical and working towards things becoming more like you want them to be. I've found, thanks to Dr. Madsen, that better is a great word because it's positive, but doesn't reflect an approval error. Things are better. We're moving in the right direction, but we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, which is important because when you give people a sense that they've arrived and fixed everything when it hasn't, it makes it harder to continue the work on it. So
Correct.
that makes a lot of sense. And the ad hominem thing that you mentioned, I experienced it. I experienced when I had a situation in a rehearsal with you and to Paul when I told somebody that he could go home early because I didn't know and I didn't ask,
Right.
and you just pulled me aside and said, thank you for the work that you're doing. I can tell that you're providing musically intelligent phrases, and you pointed out some positive things, and then you said, and please don't tell anyone they can go home without checking with me first. And
Right.
I said, okay. And it was not a problem. And it established a relationship that was clear. Just I want to communicate. We want to talk about things before you make decisions. And it was totally fine. So I could tell that there was a philosophy there. And I wanted to ask you about that. So
Yep, absolutely.
that's great. So switching to the new music discussion, because I know that you've done a lot of work and continue to do work with new music, and new music is difficult oftentimes. And up until joining Civic, I had some experience with new music, but not a lot. So my attitude going into it, and I have an inkling of why I sort of felt like this, and I'm sure you'll clarify. But I would get annoyed by the complicated rhythms that I didn't understand. I didn't know where the melody was. It just seemed noisy. It seemed like a lot of times like pots and pans music. I didn't know. And I had a bad attitude about it, honestly. But then when I started with Civic with you, you were able to change my point of view about it. And I remember generally what you said, but I want you to speak to that because I saw that your approach was very different. It's something about upholding the integrity of the music for the composer's sake. And when you spoke to that, I completely changed where I was coming from with it. So I want you to, if you could, please talk about that.
Well, this is a concept that I learned primarily from Mr. Boulez. He pointed out that playing new music should have the same values as when we play Beethoven. Certainly, you wouldn't want to be playing wrong notes and wrong rhythms in Beethoven, so why would you do it in Schoenberg, he asked. And of course, the audience and performers don't know the music, so they won't know whether the rhythms, the phrasing, and the notes are right or wrong. So it's the integrity of playing the music composed by Pierre Boulez, which should be the same as playing Mozart's music, which is crucial to successful new music performance. And so in rehearsal, I just approach it like Beethoven or Mozart or Shostakovich with the same clarity of purpose and the same specificity and the same attention to detail.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And I gather that probably conductors who are winging it and haven't planned everything out in advance will end up creating the kind of rehearsal that leads people to get irritated and annoyed by the rhythms or
that's
like that.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, the conductors who wing it in new music is particularly problematic because if they haven't studied and know how the rhythms and the primary and secondary voices interact, then they're in real trouble, and the musicians can pick that up very quickly.
Exactly. One of the biggest concepts that I ever learned from you is what you called transfer of learning. I remember it described in rehearsal in Civic because we were in rehearsal and you had been working with the strings. And usually what happens when you play, I play horn when you're in a brass section or winds and the strings are being rehearsed. You just sort of space out and look up at the ceiling and not pay attention. But
Right.
At one moment you said, this is your opportunity to hear what I just said to the strings and transfer that learning to your part. And I just discussed phrasing here, and this applies to you later. And I remember it was almost like an electric jolt, like, oh my gosh, I was spaced out and I don't know that was the first and only time that it happened, because from then on, I paid attention and it really mattered. It really made a huge difference because I was able to do that. So will you share more about what transfer of learning is and why does it matter so much?
Sure. In my opinion, transfer of learning is rarely taught in any level at school, and not surprising then, it's a foreign concept to most students. Basically, it's having the ability to take one concept and transfer it to related concepts. Obviously, if this is done correctly, there's a tremendous saving of time and significant reduction in bad vibes and tension in rehearsals. So, for instance, if the strings have a certain phrasing that comes later in the brass and the winds, I would encourage people to transfer. Most of the time, the conductor has to mention the same concept to the brass and the winds, which is, of course, annoying and a waste of time.
Exactly. And if it's not mentioned, then the brass is playing a longer note length or a different kind of phrase than what you had just established. And if the conductor isn't specific enough, doesn't even notice. So these are the kinds of things I started to notice after leaving Civic. And honestly, it's a downer when it doesn't happen in a professional setting. So
Yep.
Really is.
Absolutely correct.
Yeah, and so I think probably some of that experience in a rehearsal, even if you're not aware of the things, even if people in general aren't aware or haven't experienced a rehearsal with you, they're going to pick up on that. And it's something that I've noticed a handful of times playing in orchestras, that certain conductors they're able to exude being the boss. They come across as someone who means business on the podium, gets the utmost respect from musicians. And honestly, that was the first time I had experienced that with you and DePaul and Civic, and only a handful of other times in my professional experience in the last 15, 17, I've been playing professionally now for like 18 years. So that says something, So for the listeners who dream of being a conductor of a Big Five orchestra someday, or a leader of some kind in a college setting or anywhere actually, how do you do that?
My thoughts are: be punctual, be respectful of the musicians, be completely prepared, and be fair. And when you're consistently all of these things, the boss and the collaborator become intertwined. So that's what I would say to your excellent question.
Okay. So yeah, that was my next question, because I felt like in Civic, that even though you were deeply respected as the boss, there was also an energy of collaboration that was open and willing to discuss things. And I remember so often I felt like that so much more than any other situation that I'd had. So I would just go up to you, and knowing that you would be happy to open up the score and figure out the intonation for something or whatever. So
exactly.
Yeah.
I think that many conductors, because they're not really teachers, and because they haven't done adequate preparation, they come across as a little entitled and full of themselves, and that's distancing to the musician. So I try to avoid that and try to be as positive and welcoming as possible, while at the same time making it clear that I know what I'm doing.
Absolutely. That sounds like the right balance.
Yep.
And speaking to transfer of learning again, because of this podcast, it's funny. I've been sort of a musician anthropologist in a way, and looking at the way that people have been navigating their careers, especially if they've decided to become or create a career outside of the traditional mold. And one thing that I've noticed is that transfer of learning applies to your life, not just within like an orchestra, if you're looking at the phrasing, what the strings just did, and I'm a brass player, but transferring the way that you are about music to the way that you are in your life. So we're talking about preparation and everything. I wonder if you can give us an example of an area or a way that you transfer learning from the way that you transfer what you've been talking about, the preparation that you do into your life, scheduling, things like that.
Sure. If avoiding ad hominem remarks in rehearsal and being positive seems to work, then transferring that to one's personal life will also most likely work. And if being punctual and prepared for music rehearsals is successful, then transferring that to non-musical activities will also most likely be successful. And if making musical choices with respect to emphasizing diversity works, then not putting all your discretionary money into just a savings account will also have excellent benefits. So that's the way I think of transfer of learning outside of rehearsals and the musical settings.
Do you see a lack of transfer of learning in when you see musicians navigating the beginnings of their career or any time in their career, actually? Have you seen that as a common thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's very little sentience, awareness of what people are doing or what these musicians are doing, and there's a tremendous lack of transfer from the values that they may have achieved in musical settings, and then when they get out of musical settings, they seem to forget all those wonderful values.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and it seems a waste, since that most of the time classical musicians are incredibly focused on perfecting and becoming masterful at their instrument to be able to.
Yeah,
and I've seen it in
absolutely.
I've seen it in my own life where, my schedule's not completely ironed out. I'm working on it now. I'm changing a lot of things because of just navigating being organized for conversations. And it's funny because I see how I haven't used transfer of learning, but because I learned it from you, I can see how there's a way to transfer it into the bigger picture of your life.
Absolutely correct. Yeah, I mean, I recommend transferring these values of precise preparation that you referred to into all the other areas of one's life. I mean, you need to avoid defensive positions and learn from your mistakes and move forward in non-musical contexts as well.
Exactly. And I know people who are on time to rehearsal barely, and everywhere else they're late. So it's
correct. Exactly right.
So there's a lot of issues, I think, that people could take a look at.
Yep.
So if you had to sum it all up and give us, 3 or so key components to establishing that vibe of being the boss and collaborating as a conductor with musicians, what would you say that it would be?
Well, it would be the same things that I mentioned before when you were asking me about being a boss and sensitive to collaboration, which are be punctual, respectful, prepared, and fair. Okay. And when you're all those things, I think you're in great shape.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I love it. So I have one more final question for you.
Okay.
Who in the classical world is inspiring you right now?
That's a very good question. I would say conductor and pianist Daniel Barenboim, who I've already spoken about, and violinist Stefan Hirsch, who teaches at Roosevelt University in Chicago. He's a master teacher and an accomplished artist who reflects all of the values that I consider to be indispensable and important. So those two people, Daniel Barenboim, who now is based in Berlin, Germany, and Stefan Hirsch, who lives in Chicago.
Fantastic. I want to check out what they're doing because I know Barenboim has been in Europe now ever since he left the Chicago Post. Is that correct?
Exactly right.
Yeah. Do you still work with him?
Occasionally I do, but fortunately, because the collaboration was long while he was in Chicago, I learned an awful lot. So I don't have the need to continue to study with him actively.
Right.
So that's good.
Great. Cliff, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. I know that my audience will get a lot out of this, so thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you for having me, and best wishes.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening today. Hey, listen, I have a huge favor to ask you, and it will only take a few seconds. If you like this show, one way that you can let us know is by writing a review on iTunes and subscribing to the podcast. Writing a review will help other people find the podcast and help us immensely. It will only take a few minutes. Just head over to iTunes and search for Crushing Classical. There you can write a review and click subscribe. Thanks again.